Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. The summer night of June 14th, 2015 in Springfield, Missouri would forever change how we understand the complex dynamics between mother and child, victim and perpetrator. What appeared to be a simple case of matricide would unravel into one of the most disturbing tales of medical abuse, manipulation, and psychological torment ever documented in modern criminal history. This is the story of Dee Blanchard and her daughter Gypsy Rose. A story that forces us to question everything we think we know about motherhood, illness, and the desperate lengths one person will go to escape a living nightmare. In the quiet suburban neighborhoods of Springfield, Missouri, Claudine Dee Blanchard was known as the devoted, selfless mother who had dedicated her entire life to caring for her severely disabled daughter. Neighbors would often see the pair together, Dee pushing Gypsy Rose in her bright pink wheelchair, the young woman's bald head covered by a colorful bandana, her frail body seemingly consumed by the various illnesses that had plagued her since birth. Gypsy Rose, according to her mother, was a medical miracle. Born in 1991, she had supposedly survived a premature birth that left her with a host of devastating conditions. Dee would tell anyone who would listen about her daughter's struggles with leukemia, muscular dystrophy, epilepsy, sleep apnea, and developmental delays. The list seemed endless, and it was constantly growing. The community rallied around this brave family. Local news stations featured their story. Charitable organizations provided financial assistance, free trips to Disney World, and even helped build them a specially adapted home through Habitat for Humanity. Dee had become something of a local celebrity, praised for her unwavering dedication to her sick child. But there was something unsettling beneath this picture-perfect narrative of maternal devotion, something that would only come to light after blood was spilled, and lives were shattered. The medical records tell a story that doesn't quite add up. From the time Gypsy Rose was an infant, Dee had been taking her to doctor after doctor, presenting a catalog of symptoms that seemed to shift and change depending on the audience. When one physician couldn't find evidence of the claimed condition, Dee would simply find another doctor, often in a different city or state. Gypsy underwent years of unnecessary treatments and surgeries, including eye surgery, removal of her salivary glands, and insertion of a feeding tube. Dee shaved her daughter's head to make it look like she was undergoing chemotherapy and forced her to use a wheelchair. The surgeries were real, the medications were real, so the wheelchairs and feeding tubes and oxygen tanks were all tangible medical realities. But the illnesses they were meant to treat, many of them existed only in Dee's carefully constructed narrative. As Gypsy grew older, the deception became more elaborate. Dee claimed her daughter had the mental capacity of a 7-year-old. Despite Gypsy's obvious intelligence and awareness, she insisted that Gypsy was allergic to sugar, keeping her dangerously underweight. She administered medications that weren't prescribed, creating symptoms where none existed. Most chillingly, when Gypsy Rose was 14, she saw a neurologist in Missouri who came to believe she was a victim of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. However, this doctor never reported her case to authorities. One medical professional had seen through the charade, had recognized the signs of what we now call factitious disorder, imposed on another, a condition where a caregiver deliberately creates or exaggerates symptoms in someone under their care. But that crucial intervention never came. The system that was meant to protect Gypsy Rose failed her, leaving her trapped in a prison of manufactured illness and maternal control. The house that Habitat for Humanity built for the Blanchard family was painted bright pink, Gypsy's supposed favorite color. It was wheelchair accessible with ramps and modified bathrooms to accommodate her alleged disabilities. But for Gypsy Rose, this house wasn't a gift. It was a carefully designed cage. Dee controlled every aspect of her daughter's life, with military precision. Gypsy wasn't allowed to attend school regularly. Instead, she was homeschooled by her mother, keeping her isolated from potential witnesses to the deception. She couldn't make friends her own age, couldn't date, couldn't express any independence that might threaten the carefully maintained narrative of helplessness. The medications Dee administered kept Gypsy in a constant state of physical and mental fog. Seizure medications for epilepsy she didn't have, muscle relaxants for dystrophy she didn't suffer from, and a cocktail of other drugs that created real symptoms and dependencies. Gypsy's body was failing not from disease, but from the very treatments meant to cure non-existent conditions. The psychological manipulation was perhaps even more devastating than the physical abuse. Dee had convinced Gypsy that she was genuinely sick, that her mother was the only thing standing between her and death. Any attempt at rebellion was met with threats. Threats to withdraw love, to abandon her, to let her die from the illnesses Dee insisted would kill her without proper care. But as Gypsy grew into her 20s, cracks began to appear in the foundation of this elaborate deception. The healthy young woman's body began to resist the imposed limitations. Her mind, sharp despite the medications and manipulation, began to question the reality she had been forced to accept. The internet became Gypsy Rose's lifeline to the outside world. While Dee closely monitored her daughter's activities, she wasn't technologically savvy enough to completely prevent Gypsy from finding ways to connect with others online. Through carefully hidden social media accounts and dating sites, Gypsy began to explore a world her mother had kept from her. It was through an online Christian dating site that she met Nicholas Gaudejon, a 26-year-old man from Wisconsin with his own complex psychological issues. For Gypsy, Nicholas represented everything she had been denied: freedom, romance, escape from the suffocating control that had defined her entire existence. Their online relationship deepened over months of secret conversations. Gypsy began to share the truth about her situation, revealing that she could walk, that she wasn't intellectually disabled, that many of her supposed medical conditions were fabrications. For Nicholas, who had his own history of mental health struggles and social isolation, Gypsy became an obsession. The relationship took on increasingly intense tones. They spoke of running away together, of building a life free from Dee's control. But as their plans became more concrete, the reality of their situation became clear. Dee would never willingly let her daughter go. She had too much invested in the deception, too much to lose if the truth came out. It was during these conversations that the idea first emerged. The idea that would transform both of their lives forever and end one brutally. By 2015, the tension in the Pink House had reached a breaking point. Gypsy, now 24 years old, was desperately seeking independence. But Dee's control had only tightened. Any hint of rebellion was met with increased surveillance, more medications, and threats of institutionalization. The breaking point came when Dee discovered Gypsy trying to establish her own identity, attempting to get identification documents that would show her real age rather than the younger age. Dee had been claiming. The confrontation that followed was explosive, with Dee threatening to tie Gypsy to her bed if necessary to maintain control. It was then that Gypsy made the decision that would define the rest of her life. In her desperation, she turned to Nicholas with a request that would horrify anyone outside their desperate circumstances. She asked him to kill her mother. For Nicholas, who had developed an obsessive attachment to Gypsy and harbored his own violent fantasies, this request was both shocking and oddly compelling. His mental health issues, combined with his isolation and fixation on Gypsy, made him susceptible to her pleas for help. The plan they developed was simple but horrifying. Nicholas would travel from Wisconsin to Missouri. Gypsy would leave the front door unlocked and hide in the bathroom while he entered the house and killed Dee. Afterward, they would flee together to Wisconsin and begin their new life. 48-year-old Dee Blanchard was murdered on June 14, 2015, after her daughter Gypsy Rose and Gypsy Rose's boyfriend Nicholas Gaudejon conspired to kill her. The night of the murder unfolded exactly as planned, with devastating efficiency. Nicholas arrived in Springfield in the early morning hours of June 14th. Gypsy had left the door unlocked as promised and hidden herself in the bathroom, unable to watch but unwilling to stop what was about to happen. Gaudejon told police he stabbed Dee Blanchard to death at Gypsy's request, using a knife she gave him. He said he stole cash and mailed the knife to his Wisconsin home before the two fled there. According to court documents, Dee Blanchard was found in her bedroom, stabbed multiple times while she slept. The attack was brutal and decisive. There was no struggle, no opportunity for defense. In a matter of minutes, Nearly 2 decades of elaborate deception and abuse came to a violent end. After the murder, Gypsy and Nicholas fled to Wisconsin as planned. But their escape was short-lived. The discovery of Dee Dee's body, combined with Gypsy's suspicious disappearance, quickly led investigators to uncover the truth about their relationship and their crime. Police find Gypsy, who was unharmed and could walk. She was later arrested. Gojan, who had a lewd conduct arrest in 2013, told investigators he stabbed Dee Dee in a plan between himself and Gypsy, who hid in a bathroom during the murder. When police arrested Gypsy Rose in Wisconsin, the most shocking revelation wasn't that she had conspired to kill her mother. It was that she could walk. The young woman who had spent her life in a wheelchair, who had been presented to the world as severely disabled and mentally impaired, stood up and walked into the police station under her own power. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Dee Dee's deception. Medical records showed a pattern of doctor shopping, unnecessary procedures, and fabricated symptoms that stretched back decades. The media revealed that Dee Dee had allegedly forced Gypsy Rose Blanchard to pretend to have severe physical and mental disabilities for financial and social advantage, a condition known as factitious disorder imposed on another FDIA. The community that had rallied around the Blanchard family was shocked and horrified to learn the truth. The charitable organizations that had provided assistance, the medical professionals who had performed unnecessary procedures, the neighbors who had watched Gypsy grow up, all had been unwitting participants in an elaborate hoax that had stolen decades from a young woman's life. The legal proceedings that followed presented an almost impossible challenge for the justice system. How do you prosecute someone for murder when that person was themselves a victim of horrific long-term abuse? How do you balance the need for justice for Dee Blanchard with recognition of the abuse that Gypsy Rose had endured? Gypsy Rose Blanchard, born July 27, 1991, is an American woman who in June 2015 conspired with her then-boyfriend to kill her mother, Claudine Dee Blanchard, at their home in Springfield, Missouri. She was initially charged with first-degree murder, but later pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The prosecutors acknowledged the complexity of the case. While they couldn't ignore the fact that Gypsy had conspired to commit murder, they also recognized that she was a victim of unprecedented abuse. The plea agreement reflected this nuanced understanding of her circumstances. Nicholas Gojan faced a different fate. Gojan was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Plus, Gojan was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. While he claimed to have acted out of love for Gypsy, the courts found that his actions constituted premeditated murder without the mitigating circumstances of long-term abuse. Perhaps the most telling detail about Gypsy Rose's case emerged during her time in prison. In 2017, Gypsy Blanchard told 20/20/20 she felt freer in prison than she ever had at home. This statement, shocking to outsiders, perfectly captured the reality of her life with Dee Dee. In prison, Gypsy had something she had never experienced before: autonomy. She could choose what to eat, when to sleep, what to read. She wasn't forced to take unnecessary medications or pretend to be someone she wasn't. For the first time in her life, she was seen and treated as the intelligent, capable young woman she had always been. During her 8 years of incarceration, Gypsy continued her education, developed genuine friendships, and began the long process of understanding and healing from the trauma she had experienced. She also began speaking out about her case, helping to raise awareness about Munchausen syndrome by proxy and advocating for other victims of similar abuse. Gypsy Rose has been released from prison as of December 28, 2023. Her release marked not just the end of her sentence, but the beginning of a new chapter in a life that had been stolen from her for so many years. The woman who walked out of prison at age 32 was vastly different from the frightened, manipulated young person who had conspired to kill her mother. Gypsy had used her time in prison to develop the sense of self that had been systematically destroyed by her mother's abuse. She had learned to make decisions, to trust her own judgment, to see herself as valuable and worthy of love and respect. The Blanchard case has had far-reaching implications beyond the immediate tragedy of the crime itself. It has forced medical professionals to re-examine how they identify and respond to suspected cases of medical child abuse. It has highlighted the gaps in our system's ability to protect vulnerable individuals from sophisticated forms of abuse. The case has also sparked important conversations about victimhood and justice. Her abuse was allowed to continue until she was old enough to escape it. In a twist of fate, Gypsy Rose served 8 years in prison for conspiring to murder the mother who abused her by a system that allowed it to happen. The same system that failed to protect Gypsy from decades of abuse ultimately prosecuted her for the crime that freed her from that abuse. One of the most difficult aspects of this case is understanding Dee Blanchard herself. She wasn't a cartoonish villain, but a complex individual whose actions destroyed multiple lives, including ultimately her own. The psychological profile that emerges from the evidence suggests someone driven by a pathological need for attention and control. Someone who found in her daughter's manufactured illnesses a way to be seen as special, important, and worthy of sympathy. Dee Dee's family history reveals patterns that may have contributed to her behavior. There were allegations of her having poisoned her own stepmother. Though these were never proven, she had a history of troubled relationships and financial difficulties. And in Gypsy's illnesses, she found a solution to multiple problems. Financial support from charitable organizations, social status as a devoted mother, and complete control over another human being. But understanding Dee Dee's motivations doesn't diminish the horror of what she did to her daughter. For nearly 2 decades, she systematically destroyed Gypsy's physical health, stole her childhood and adolescence, and created a prison of lies and manipulation from which the only escape seemed to be violence. Perhaps one of the most troubling aspects of this case is how completely the medical system failed. Gypsy Rose, dozens of healthcare professionals encountered her over the years, performed unnecessary procedures, prescribed harmful medications, and never questioned the inconsistencies in her presentation or her mother's claims. The lone neurologist who suspected abuse never reported his concerns to authorities, a failure that cost Gypsy years of continued abuse. This highlights critical gaps in training and protocols for identifying medical child abuse, gaps that the case has helped to address in subsequent years. The case has led to important reforms in how medical professionals are trained to recognize and respond to suspected abuse. It has also highlighted the importance of multidisciplinary approaches to complex medical cases, and the need for better communication between healthcare providers. From a psychological perspective, Gypsy's story is both heartbreaking and remarkable. Despite years of systematic abuse designed to break her spirit and sense of self, she retained enough of her core identity to eventually fight back. The decision to arrange her mother's murder was horrific, but it came from a place of desperate survival instinct rather than malicious intent. The trauma bonding that occurred between Gypsy and her mother was profound and complex. Despite the abuse, Gypsy genuinely loved Dee Dee and felt guilty about her death. This complex emotional relationship is typical of long-term abuse situations and helps explain why it took so long for Gypsy to break free. The fact that Gypsy was able to recover and build a healthy sense of self during her incarceration speaks to remarkable resilience and inner strength. It also highlights the importance of appropriate therapeutic intervention for abuse survivors and the possibility of healing even from the most severe trauma. Today, Gypsy Rose Blanchard represents something unique in the annals of criminal justice. A convicted killer who is also undeniably a victim, someone who committed a terrible act as the only means of escaping an unthinkable situation. Her story challenges our preconceptions about crime and punishment, about victimhood and agency. The case continues to resonate because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of abuse, the failures of systems meant to protect the vulnerable, and the complex moral calculations that desperate people make when faced with impossible situations. As Gypsy builds her new life as a free woman, she carries with her the scars of her ordeal, but also the strength that allowed her to survive it. Her story serves as both a cautionary tale about the sophisticated forms that abuse can take, and an inspiration about the human capacity for resilience and renewal. The murder of Dee Blanchard was a crime that shocked a community and ultimately revealed a tragedy that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. It's a story that defies easy categorization. There are no clear heroes or villains, no simple moral lessons, no easy answer. What emerges from this complex and disturbing case is a deeper understanding of how abuse can operate in plain sight, how systems meant to protect can fail those who need them most, and how the human spirit can survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. The Pink House in Springfield, Missouri stands as a monument to the dangers of unchecked power over another human being. But Gypsy Rose Blanchard, survivor and perpetrator, victim and convicted criminal, represents something more hopeful. The possibility that even from the darkest circumstances, redemption and healing can emerge. In the end, the murder of Dee Blanchard is not just a true crime story. It's a human story, about the lengths to which someone will go to maintain control, the depths to which abuse can sink, and the desperate measures that survival sometimes requires. It's a story that continues to evolve as Gypsy Rose builds the independent life that was stolen from her for so many years. As we close this chapter of one of the most complex criminal cases in recent memory, we're left not with answers, but with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human nature and the ongoing work required to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. The case of Dee and Gypsy Rose Blanchard serves as both a tragedy and a call to action, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous prisons are built not of concrete and steel, but of lies, manipulation, and false love. Please, if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to the channel where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. In the quiet neighborhoods of Jacksonville, Florida, where Spanish moss drapes ancient oak trees and children's laughter echoes through suburban streets, November 1998 began like any other autumn month. The air carried that familiar Florida warmth, tinged with the promise of cooler days ahead. Families went about their daily routines, children attended school, and neighbors waved to each other across manicured lawns. But beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful community, a darkness was about to unfold that would shatter the innocence of an entire city and leave scars that would last for decades. Maddie Clifton, known to everyone as Maddie, was 8 years old in 1998. Born on June 17, 1990, she was the kind of child who brought light into every room she entered. With her bright smile and curious nature, Maddie was beloved by her family and friends in the Lakewood neighborhood of Jacksonville. The Lakewood area was the kind of place where children could still ride their bikes freely, where screen doors remained unlocked, and where neighbors looked out for each other's kids. It was a community built on trust, where parents felt safe letting their children play outside until the streetlights came on. Maddie lived with her family in a modest home on Heckscher Drive, a quiet street lined with single-story houses and small front yards. She was an active, social child who loved playing with the neighborhood kids. Among these children was a teenager who lived just across the street, a 14-year-old boy named Joshua Phillips. Joshua was known in the neighborhood as a quiet, somewhat shy teenager. At 14, he was navigating those awkward adolescent years, trying to fit in with peers while dealing with the typical pressures of high school. To most adults in the community, he seemed like a normal teenager, perhaps a bit withdrawn, but nothing that raised any red flags. The relationship between 8-year-old Maddie and 14-year-old Joshua might have seemed unusual to some. The age gap was significant, but in tight-knit neighborhoods it wasn't uncommon for children of different ages to play together. Joshua was seen as one of the big kids that the younger children looked up to. What no one could have imagined was that this seemingly innocent neighborhood dynamic would soon turn deadly. Tuesday, November 3rd, 1998, started as an ordinary day in the Clifton household. Maddie went to school, came home, and like many children her age, was eager to go outside and play. The weather was pleasant, perfect for an afternoon of neighborhood games and exploration. As the afternoon wore on, Maddie made her way over to the Phillips house across the street. It wasn't unusual for her to visit. She had played with Joshua and around his house many times before. The familiarity of the routine made it seem safe. Normal, part of the everyday rhythm of childhood in suburban Florida. But something was different about this particular afternoon. What exactly transpired between Maddie and Joshua in those crucial hours may never be fully understood. But what we do know is that it would be the last time anyone would see Maddie Clifton alive. According to Joshua's later confession, the events unfolded in his bedroom. He claimed that he and Maddie were playing when she accidentally hit a baseball in his room, causing it to strike his aquarium and create a loud noise. Joshua said he was terrified that his father would hear the commotion and become angry with him. In that moment of panic and fear, 14-year-old Joshua Phillips made a decision that would destroy multiple lives forever. Rather than simply explaining what had happened or helping to clean up the mess, Joshua's response was swift and brutal. He struck Maddie repeatedly with a baseball bat. The small, trusting 8-year-old girl who had come to his house to play was suddenly fighting for her life. But Joshua didn't stop there. He also stabbed her multiple times with a pocket knife, inflicting at least 9 stab wounds throughout her small body. The violence was shocking in its intensity and duration. This wasn't a single moment of rage or accident. It was a sustained attack on a defenseless child. When it was over, Maddie Clifton was dead, and Joshua Phillips was faced with the horrific reality of what he had done. After committing this unthinkable act, Joshua was confronted with a terrible dilemma. He had murdered his 8-year-old neighbor in his own bedroom, and now he had to decide what to do with her body. What happened next would shock even seasoned law enforcement officials. Rather than confessing, calling for help, or even running away, Joshua made the calculated decision to hide the evidence of his crime. He stuffed Maddie's small body underneath his waterbed, concealing her in the bed frame where no one would think to look. Then, incredibly, he went about his life as if nothing had happened. He cleaned up the blood, went to school the next day, interacted with his family, and participated in the massive search efforts that would soon consume the entire Jacksonville community. The ability to compartmentalize such a horrific act and continue with normal daily activities revealed a disturbing aspect of Joshua's psychology. While his neighbors, law enforcement, and volunteers combed through the city looking for Maddie, Joshua slept every night directly above her body. This wasn't just a cover-up, it was a prolonged deception that required Joshua to lie to everyone around him, while maintaining the facade of a concerned neighbor. He would have to look Maddie's parents in the eye, knowing exactly what had happened to their daughter and where she was. When Maddie failed to come home for dinner on November 3rd, her family initially wasn't overly concerned. Children sometimes lost track of time while playing, and it wasn't uncommon for kids to be a little late. But as the evening progressed and there was still no sign of Maddie, worry began to set in. Her parents began calling neighbors and friends, asking if anyone had seen their daughter. They walked through the neighborhood, calling her name, checking all the usual places where children might play or hide. As the hours ticked by, their concern grew into genuine fear. By the next morning, with still no sign of Maddie, her family contacted the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office to report her missing. What began as a routine missing child case quickly escalated into one of the largest search efforts in Jacksonville's history. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of volunteers joined law enforcement officers in searching for the missing 8-year-old. They combed through neighborhoods, wooded areas, retention ponds, and abandoned buildings. Search dogs were brought in, helicopters circled overhead, and dive teams searched local waterways. The media coverage was extensive, with local television stations providing regular updates and showing Maddie's photograph to viewers throughout North Florida and South Georgia. Her face became familiar to thousands of people who had never met her, but were desperately hoping to help bring her home safely. Missing child posters appeared on every available surface: telephone poles, store windows, community bulletin boards. The entire city seemed to be united in the effort to find Maddie Clifton. Volunteers organized search parties, distributed flyers, and maintained a constant vigil of hope and determination. Among these searchers was Joshua Phillips himself. In a display of calculated deception that still chills investigators today, he actively participated in looking for the very child he had murdered. He joined search parties, helped distribute flyers, and expressed concern for Maddie's welfare to anyone who would listen. To the adults around him, Joshua appeared to be a caring neighbor boy, worried about his young friend. No one suspected that he knew exactly where Maddie was, because her body was hidden just feet from where he slept each night. For 7 agonizing days, the search for Maddie Clifton continued. With each passing hour, the chances of finding her alive diminished, but the community refused to give up hope. The search expanded beyond Jacksonville, with law enforcement agencies from surrounding counties joining the effort. During this time, Joshua Phillips continued his elaborate deception. He attended school, did his homework, ate meals with his family, and maintained the pretense of being a normal teenager concerned about his missing neighbor. The psychological fortitude required to maintain such a lie while surrounded by grieving family members and desperate searchers suggests a level of coldness that few could comprehend. His mother, Melissa Phillips, later described noticing that Joshua seemed somewhat anxious during this period, but she attributed it to natural concern about Maddie's disappearance. Like everyone else in the neighborhood, she was focused on the search efforts and couldn't imagine that her own son could be connected to the tragedy unfolding around them. The Phillips family home became part of the extended crime scene as searchers looked everywhere for clues about Maddie's disappearance. Investigators spoke with Joshua, along with many other neighborhood children, asking if they had seen anything unusual or if Maddie had mentioned anything about where she might go. Joshua's responses to these questions were carefully crafted to deflect suspicion while appearing helpful. He claimed to have seen Maddie on the afternoon of November 3rd, but said she had left his house to go play elsewhere. This half-truth was enough to satisfy investigators initially, as they had no reason to suspect that a 14-year-old neighbor boy could be capable of such violence. The entire time, Maddie's body lay decomposing beneath Joshua's waterbed, just yards away from where investigators conducted interviews and family members held prayer vigils. On November 10th, 1998, exactly 1 week after Maddie Clifton disappeared, the horrific truth finally came to light in the most unexpected way possible. Melissa Phillips was cleaning her son's bedroom when she noticed what appeared to be water leaking from underneath Joshua's waterbed. Concerned about damage to the floor, she decided to investigate the source of the leak. As she moved the mattress and looked into the bed frame, she made a discovery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. There, stuffed into the confined space beneath the waterbed, was the decomposing body of 8-year-old Maddie Clifton. The shock and horror of this discovery is difficult to imagine. A mother going about routine household cleaning, suddenly confronted with the brutalized remains of a child, and the immediate awful realization of what this meant about her own son. Melissa Phillips ran outside, where she flagged down a police officer who was patrolling the neighborhood as part of the ongoing search efforts. The irony was devastating. Law enforcement had been searching everywhere for Maddie, while all along she was hidden in the home of a family that had appeared to be helping with the search. Within minutes, the Phillips house was surrounded by law enforcement vehicles. The massive search operation that had consumed the community for a week suddenly focused on a single location: the bedroom of Joshua Phillips. Crime scene investigators carefully removed Maddie's body from its gruesome hiding place. The condition of the remains and the evidence collected from the scene told a story of incredible violence. The 8-year-old had suffered multiple blunt force trauma injuries consistent with being beaten with a baseball bat, as well as numerous stab wounds from a knife. When investigators confronted Joshua Phillips with the discovery of Maddie's body in his bedroom, the teenager's week-long deception finally crumbled. Faced with undeniable physical evidence and the impossibility of maintaining his innocence, Joshua confessed to killing his 8-year-old neighbor. His confession was shocking not just for its content, but for the matter-of-fact way he described the events. According to Joshua, he had killed Maddie to prevent her from crying after the baseball accident, fearing that the noise would get him in trouble with his father. This explanation revealed a disturbing disconnect between cause and effect. The idea that murder was a reasonable solution to avoid parental discipline. The confession also revealed the calculated nature of the cover-up. Joshua admitted to hiding Maddie's body under his bed and then participating in the search efforts while knowing exactly where she was. This wasn't a panicked child making poor decisions in the aftermath of an accident. This was methodical concealment of a crime. Joshua Phillips was immediately arrested and charged with first-degree murder. At 14 years old, he became one of the youngest people in Florida history to face such serious charges. The arrest sent shockwaves through Jacksonville and the broader Florida community, as people struggled to comprehend how someone so young could commit such a brutal crime. The legal implications were complex. Florida law allowed for juveniles to be charged as adults in certain circumstances, particularly for serious violent crimes. Prosecutors had to decide whether Joshua should be tried in juvenile court or adult court, a decision that would have enormous implications for his potential sentence. Given the premeditated nature of the cover-up and the brutal violence of the crime, prosecutors ultimately decided to try Joshua as an adult. This meant he could face the same penalties as an adult convicted of first-degree murder, including the possibility of life in prison without parole. As investigators delved deeper into the case, disturbing details about Joshua Phillips began to emerge. While he had appeared to be a normal teenager to most of his neighbors, a more complex picture began to develop. Friends and classmates described Joshua as somewhat of a loner who had difficulty fitting in with his peers. He was reportedly fascinated with violent imagery and had shown interest in disturbing content, including violent pornography and graphic materials that were naive for someone his age. Some investigators theorized that Joshua's exposure to violent sexual content may have influenced his actions, though this remained speculation rather than proven fact. What was clear was that there had been warning signs that might have predicted his capacity for violence, though none severe enough to have prevented the tragedy. The investigation also revealed the calculated nature of Joshua's deception during the week-long search. Analysis of his behavior during this period showed that he had actively participated in misleading investigators and had shown no genuine remorse for his actions until confronted with undeniable evidence. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that Joshua had slept in his bedroom every night for a week while Maddie's body decomposed underneath his bed. This level of compartmentalization suggested a psychological makeup that was far from normal, even for a troubled teenager. Forensic evidence supported Joshua's confession, confirming that Maddie had been beaten with a baseball bat and stabbed multiple times. The brutality of the attack on such a small victim was shocking even to experienced investigators who had seen numerous violent crimes. The revelation that Maddie Clifton had been murdered by her 14-year-old neighbor sent shockwaves through Jacksonville and beyond. The case garnered national attention, with media outlets struggling to comprehend how such a young person could commit such a brutal crime. For the Lakewood neighborhood, the betrayal was particularly devastating. Residents had trusted Joshua Phillips, had included him in their search efforts, and had never imagined that he could be capable of such violence. The sense of safety and community that had defined the neighborhood was shattered overnight. Maddie's family faced the unimaginable grief of not only losing their beloved daughter, but also learning the horrific circumstances of her death. The fact that they had trusted Joshua, had welcomed him into their lives, and had even thanked him for helping search for Maddie made the betrayal even more painful. The broader Jacksonville community struggled to process the implications of the case. Parents looked at their own children and neighbors differently, wondering what signs they might have missed and how they could protect their families from similar tragedies. Child safety experts used the case as an opportunity to discuss warning signs of violent behavior in young people, though they acknowledged that Joshua's actions were so extreme that they would have been difficult to predict based on typical risk factors. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about juvenile justice and how society should handle young people who commit adult crimes. At what age should someone be held fully responsible for their actions? How should the justice system balance punishment with the possibility of rehabilitation for juvenile offenders? The legal case against Joshua Phillips moved forward swiftly. Given the strength of the evidence, including his confession and the discovery of Maddie's body in his bedroom, there was little question about his guilt. The main legal questions centered around the appropriate charges and potential sentence. Prosecutors argued that the premeditated nature of the cover-up, combined with the extreme violence of the crime, justified trying Joshua as an adult and seeking the maximum possible sentence. They painted a picture of a calculated killer who had shown no remorse until caught and who had actively deceived the community during the search for his victim. The defense faced an almost impossible task. With such overwhelming evidence of guilt, they focused on Joshua's age and mental state, arguing that a 14-year-old could not fully comprehend the consequences of his actions and deserved the possibility of rehabilitation rather than a lifetime in prison. Mental health experts testified about adolescent brain development, explaining that teenagers are not neurologically equipped to make the same rational decisions as adults. They argued that Joshua's actions, while inexcusable, were the result of an underdeveloped capacity for judgment rather than irredeemable evil. The prosecution countered with evidence of the calculated nature of Joshua's deception, arguing that his ability to lie convincingly for a week while participating in search efforts demonstrated a level of sophistication that belied claims about his mental immaturity. The case raised fundamental questions about justice, punishment, and the possibility of redemption for even the most serious juvenile offenders. The trial of Joshua Phillips began on July 6, 1999, in Duval County Circuit Court, despite the complexity of the legal and moral issues involved. The actual trial was remarkably brief, lasting only 2 days. The evidence against Joshua was overwhelming and largely uncontested. His confession, the discovery of Maddie's body in his bedroom, and the forensic evidence all pointed to his guilt, beyond any reasonable doubt. The defense did not seriously challenge these facts, but instead focused on mitigation, trying to explain why a 14-year-old would commit such a crime and arguing for mercy in sentencing. Witnesses testified about Joshua's character, his family background, and his behavior in the days following Maddie's disappearance. The prosecution painted a picture of a calculating killer who had shown no genuine remorse for his actions, while the defense portrayed a troubled teenager who had made a catastrophic mistake. The testimony about the crime itself was difficult for everyone in the courtroom to hear. Details about Maddie's injuries and the condition of her body when discovered were presented matter-of-factly, but had a profound emotional impact on all present. Perhaps most poignant was testimony from Maddie's family about the impact of her loss on their lives. They described a vibrant, loving child whose future had been stolen, and the devastating effect her death had on everyone who knew her. After hearing all the evidence and arguments, the jury deliberated for just over 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. The speed of their deliberation reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the clarity of Joshua's guilt. On August 26, 1999, Joshua Phillips was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At age 15, he became one of the youngest people in American history to receive such a sentence. The judge's decision reflected the brutal nature of the crime and the calculated deception that followed. While acknowledging Joshua's young age, the court concluded that the severity of his actions and his behavior afterward demonstrated that he posed a continuing danger to society. For Maddie's family, the sentence provided a measure of justice, but could never truly compensate for their loss. They had lost their daughter, their sense of safety, and their trust in their community. The legal proceedings had provided answers about what happened to Maddie, but no amount of punishment could bring her back or erase their pain. The case continued to generate discussion about juvenile justice, child psychology, and community safety. It became a reference point for debates about how society should handle young people who commit adult crimes, with different perspectives on whether such individuals are capable of rehabilitation or represent a permanent threat. Joshua Phillips was transferred to adult prison, where he would spend his days contemplating the choices that had led him there. At such a young age, he faced the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars for actions he had taken as a teenager. The story of Joshua Phillips didn't end with his conviction and sentencing. Over the years, changing legal precedents would affect his case and raise new questions about juvenile justice. In 2012, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life sentences without parole for juvenile offenders were unconstitutional. This decision was based on scientific research showing that adolescent brains are not fully developed, particularly in areas related to decision-making and impulse control. The ruling meant that Joshua Phillips, along with many other juvenile lifers, was entitled to have his sentence reconsidered. In 2017, he was resentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. This meant that he would become eligible for parole consideration in 2023, having served 25 years of his sentence. This development was controversial and painful for Maddie's family, who felt that the original sentence of life without parole was appropriate given the brutality of the crime. They argued that some crimes are so heinous that the age of the perpetrator should not matter, and that Joshua had forfeited his right to freedom when he chose to murder an innocent child. Supporters of juvenile justice reform, however, argued that the resentencing reflected a more sophisticated understanding of adolescent development and the possibility of rehabilitation, even for those who commit serious crimes. In 2025, nearly 27 years after Maddie Clifton's murder, Joshua Phillips returned to court seeking a review of his sentence. Now in his 40s, he had spent more than half his life in prison for a crime he committed as a teenager. The prospect of his potential release generated renewed attention to the case and fresh pain for Maddie's family. They argued that Maddie's sentence was final. She would never have the opportunity to grow up, get married, have children, or contribute to society, and that her killer should not be given chances she would never have. Phillips' attorneys argued that he had been rehabilitated during his time in prison, had expressed genuine remorse for his actions, and deserved the opportunity to demonstrate that he was no longer the troubled teenager who had committed such a horrific crime. The case highlighted the ongoing tension between justice and mercy, between punishment and rehabilitation, and between the rights of victims and the possibility of redemption for offenders. The murder of Maddie Clifton left scars that extended far beyond her immediate family. The case fundamentally changed how the Jacksonville community viewed child safety and neighborhood relationships. Parents became more cautious about allowing their children to play freely in the neighborhood. The trust that had once characterized the community was replaced by wariness and suspicion. The case also had a lasting impact on juvenile justice policy and practice. It became a frequently cited example in debates about how to handle young people who commit serious violent crimes, with different stakeholders drawing different lessons from the tragedy. For law enforcement, the case served as a reminder that perpetrators of violent crimes can be found in unexpected places, and that investigators must be prepared to consider all possibilities, even when they challenge conventional assumptions about who is capable of violence. The media coverage of the case raised questions about how society discusses and depicts juvenile crime, balancing the public's right to information with concerns about the impact of publicity on young offenders and their families. More than 25 years after her death, Maddie Clifton is remembered not just as a victim of a senseless crime, but as a vibrant child whose life was cut tragically short. Her family and friends have worked to keep her memory alive, sharing stories about her personality, her dreams, and the joy she brought to everyone around her. The case serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of innocence and the devastating impact that violence can have on individuals, families, and communities. It challenges us to think about how we protect children, how we identify and address warning signs of potential violence, and how we balance justice with mercy when young people make irreversible mistakes. Maddie Clifton was 8 years old when she died. She should have had the opportunity to grow up, to experience all the joys and challenges that life had to offer. Instead, she became the victim of a crime so shocking that it continues to resonate decades later, a reminder of both the capacity for evil that exists in our world and the precious nature of the innocence we must work to protect. As we reflect on this tragic case, we remember not just the violence that ended Maddie's life, but the life itself. A little girl who deserved so much more than the fate that befell her on that November afternoon in 1998. Her memory serves as a call to vigilance, to community, and to the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. In the quiet neighborhoods of Jacksonville, where Spanish moss still drapes ancient oak trees and children still play in suburban streets, the story of Maddie Clifton serves as both a tragedy and a warning, a reminder that darkness can lurk behind the most ordinary facades, and that our most sacred duty is to protect the innocent among us. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now let's move on to our third story. Story 3. In the quiet residential streets of Van Nuys, California, February 24, 1986 began like any other Monday morning. The sun filtered through the morning haze that often blankets Los Angeles, and life moved at its usual unhurried pace in this middle-class neighborhood. But by evening, one address on Balboa Boulevard would become forever etched in the annals of one of the most shocking betrayals in law enforcement history. 29-year-old Sherri Rasmussen should have been preparing for another ordinary evening with her husband of just 3 months. Instead, she was fighting for her life against an attacker whose identity would remain hidden for over 2 decades, protected by a badge in the very institution meant to seek justice for victims like her. Sherri Rasmussen was born on February 7, 1957, into a world that seemed to promise her everything. She possessed the kind of gentle strength that drew people to her, intelligent, compassionate, and driven by an unwavering desire to help others. Her path led her naturally into nursing, a profession that perfectly suited her caring nature and sharp mind. By 1986, Sherri had built a successful career as a critical care nurse. She worked long, demanding hours, often dealing with life and death situations that would leave many people emotionally drained. But Sherri seemed to thrive in this environment. Her colleagues described her as someone who could remain calm under pressure while never losing sight of the human element in her patients' care. Her personal life had recently taken a wonderful turn. In November 1985, she had married John Rattin, a young electrical engineer who worked in the aerospace industry. Their courtship had been the kind of romance that friends envied, built on mutual respect, shared interests, and a deep affection that was obvious to anyone who saw them together. The newlyweds had settled into a comfortable 2-story townhouse condominium in Van Nuys, a respectable middle-class area of the San Fernando Valley. It was the kind of place where young professionals put down roots, where children played in front yards, and where neighbors knew each other by name. It should have been safe. It should have been the beginning of a long, happy life together. John Ruetten's commute home from work on February 24th was routine. He had no reason to expect anything other than a normal evening with his wife. Perhaps they would discuss their day over dinner, watch television, or make plans for the upcoming weekend. These were the small, precious moments that newlyweds treasure, the building blocks of a shared life. But when John arrived home around 6 p.m., he immediately sensed something was wrong. The front door, which Sherri was meticulous about keeping locked, stood slightly ajar. As he pushed it open and stepped inside, the scene that greeted him was one of chaos and horror that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The townhouse had been turned upside down. Furniture was overturned, belongings scattered across the floor, and clear signs of a violent struggle were evident throughout the living area. but it was upstairs in the master bedroom, where John found his worst fears realized. Sherri lay motionless on the bedroom floor, her body positioned in a way that immediately told him she was beyond help. She was dressed in her nightgown and bathrobe, suggesting she had not been expecting visitors. The brutality of the scene was overwhelming. Sherri had clearly fought desperately for her life. John's first instinct was to call for help, though some part of him already knew it was too late. The paramedics who responded confirmed what he feared. Sherri was dead, and had been for hours. The medical examiner would later determine that she had suffered multiple traumatic injuries. She had been beaten savagely and shot 3 times. When the first police officers arrived at the scene on Balboa Boulevard, they encountered what appeared to be a fairly straightforward if tragic case: the ransacked condition of the townhouse, the apparent signs of forced entry, and the seemingly random violence all pointed to one conclusion: Sherri Rasmussen had been the victim of a burglary gone wrong. This theory made sense to the investigating officers. Van Nuys, like many parts of Los Angeles in the 1980s, had been experiencing an uptick in property crimes. Burglars would target middle-class homes during the day when residents were at work, looking for easy-to-carry valuables like electronics, jewelry, and cash. If surprised by a homeowner's unexpected return, these situations could quickly turn violent. The lead detectives on the case, experienced investigators who had seen their share of residential burglaries, began building their case around this premise. They noted that some electronic equipment appeared to be missing from the home, and there were signs that the intruder had been searching through drawers and closets. To them, the evidence told a clear story. Burglars had broken in. Sherri had surprised them, and in the panic of the moment, they had killed her. But even from the beginning, there were elements of the crime scene that didn't quite fit this neat narrative. The violence inflicted on Sherri seemed unusually personal and intense for a burglary gone wrong. Burglars typically wanted to get in and out quickly, taking what they could carry and avoiding confrontation. The level of brutality here suggested something more intimate, more personal. While the LAPD was convinced they were dealing with a random crime, Sherri's father, Nels Rasmussen, harbored deep suspicions that the motive was far more personal. Nels had been a protective father who paid attention to his daughter's life, and in the weeks before her death, Sherri had shared some troubling information with her parents. She had told them about a woman who was bothering her and John, someone from John's past who seemed unable to accept that their relationship was over. This woman had been calling the house, sometimes hanging up when Sherri answered. She had even shown up at Sherri's workplace, creating uncomfortable confrontations that left Sherri feeling unsettled and threatened. The woman's name was Stephanie Lazarus, and she was a police officer with the LAPD. John had met Stephanie during his college years at UCLA. They had dated on and off, maintaining what John later described as a casual relationship that he never considered serious. But for Stephanie, the connection had meant much more. Even after John had clearly moved on and begun his relationship with Sherri, Stephanie continued to pursue him with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Nels Rasmussen tried to share this information with the investigating detectives, urging them to look into Stephanie Lazarus as a potential suspect, but the officers seemed uninterested in pursuing this lead. After all, Stephanie was one of their own. A fellow police officer, the idea that a member of law enforcement could be responsible for such a brutal crime seemed far-fetched to investigators who were already convinced they were dealing with a burglary. This reluctance to investigate one of their own would prove to be one of the most tragic missteps in the case. The LAPD's tunnel vision on the burglary theory, combined with their unwillingness to seriously consider that a police officer might be a suspect, would allow the real killer to remain free for over 2 decades. As the investigation continued through the winter and spring of 1986, the LAPD doubled down on their burglary theory. They followed up on reports of similar crimes in the area, interviewed known burglars, and pursued various leads that all seemed to support their initial assessment. In April 1986, their conviction in this theory seemed to be validated when another burglary occurred in the same neighborhood. A woman had interrupted 2 men ransacking her home, and they had fled when she surprised them. Witness sketches were made of the suspects, and investigators felt confident they had identified the same individuals responsible for Sherri's murder. But despite their confidence, no arrests were ever made in connection with these sketches. No physical evidence ever linked these suspected burglars to Sherri's murder, and no one was ever able to explain why. If this was truly a random burglary, the level of violence had been so extreme and personal. As months turned into years, the case slowly migrated from active investigation to cold case status. Files were boxed up and stored away. The detectives who had worked the case moved on to other assignments, retired or transferred to different divisions. The murder of Sherri Rasmussen became just another unsolved case in a department that handled hundreds of homicides each year. But the physical evidence remained, carefully preserved in the LAPD's evidence storage facility. DNA technology was still in its infancy in 1986. But investigators had collected biological samples from the crime scene, including material from what appeared to be a bite mark on Sherri's arm. At the time, this evidence could do little more than establish blood type, but it would prove to be the key that would eventually unlock the case more than 20 years later. While the Rasmussen family grieved and wondered if justice would ever be served, Stephanie Lazarus continued building her career with the LAPD. She had joined the force in the early 1980s as part of a generation of women entering law enforcement in greater numbers than ever before. Stephanie was, by most accounts, a competent officer who earned the respect of her colleagues and supervisors. She was professional, detail-oriented, and seemed genuinely committed to police work. Over the years, she advanced through the ranks and eventually specialized in art theft investigations, a prestigious assignment that dealt with high-value crimes involving stolen artwork and cultural artifacts. To her colleagues, Stephanie appeared to be exactly what she seemed, a dedicated police officer who had found her calling in law enforcement. She was social, well-liked, and maintained friendships throughout the department. She eventually married and started a family, creating what appeared to be a stable, normal life. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, Stephanie harbored a dark secret that she guarded zealously. She had committed the perfect crime, hidden in plain sight among the very people whose job it was to catch killers like her. Her position as a police officer had given her an invaluable advantage. She knew how investigations worked, understood what evidence could be damaging, and had access to information about the case's progress. More importantly, her badge had made her essentially invisible as a suspect. The investigating detectives' reluctance to seriously consider her as a perpetrator had allowed her to escape scrutiny during the critical early days of the investigation. By the time the case went cold, she had become just another officer who might have once known the victim's husband, hardly worth a second thought. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, advances in DNA technology began revolutionizing cold case investigations across the country. What had once been impossible, extracting useful genetic information from tiny degraded biological samples, was becoming routine. Police departments began establishing dedicated cold case units to revisit unsolved crimes with these powerful new tools. The LAPD created its own cold case unit, and among the hundreds of unsolved murders in their files, the Rasmussen case eventually caught the attention of Detective Jim Nuttall. Unlike the original investigators, Nuttall approached the case with fresh eyes and no preconceived notions about what had happened on that February day in 1986. As he reviewed the case file, Nuttall was struck by several inconsistencies in the burglary theory. The level of violence seemed excessive for an interrupted burglary. The missing items weren't particularly valuable or easy to carry. Most importantly, the bite mark evidence suggested a level of personal, intimate violence that didn't fit with random criminal activity. Nuttall began to focus on the biological evidence that had been collected at the scene. DNA technology had advanced to the point where meaningful results could potentially be obtained from samples that would have been useless in 1986. If they could develop a DNA profile from the crime scene evidence, they might finally be able to identify Sherri's killer. In 2005, nearly 20 years after Sherri's murder, the LAPD crime lab was able to extract a DNA profile from the biological material found at the crime scene. For the first time, investigators had a genetic fingerprint of the killer. Now they needed to find a match. The profile was run through various DNA databases, but no hits were found among known criminals. This actually supported what Nuttall was beginning to suspect, that Sherri's killer was not a career criminal or burglar, but someone with a personal motive who had managed to avoid detection for 2 decades. Nuttall began to focus more seriously on the leads that had been dismissed by the original investigators. He re-interviewed John Retton, who provided more details about his past relationship with Stephanie Lazarus and the uncomfortable encounters she had had with Sherri before the murder. Armed with this information and the DNA profile, Nuttall began to consider the unthinkable, that a fellow police officer might have committed this crime. But he needed to be absolutely certain. Accusing a colleague of murder based on circumstantial evidence would be career suicide, unless he had ironclad proof. The breakthrough came in 2009, when investigators devised a clever plan to obtain Stephanie's DNA. Without her knowledge, they arranged for her to attend what appeared to be a routine meeting, during which she was offered a cup of water, After the meeting, the cup was carefully preserved and sent to the lab for analysis. When the results came back, they were definitive. Stephanie Lazarus's DNA matched the DNA found at the Sherri Rasmussen crime scene. After 23 years, they finally had their killer. On June 5, 2009, Stephanie Lazarus began what she thought would be another ordinary day at work. She had no idea that her carefully constructed double life was about to come crashing down around her. Investigators had spent weeks planning her arrest, knowing that taking down a fellow officer required perfect execution. They couldn't afford any mistakes or procedural errors that might jeopardize the prosecution. The arrest needed to be clean, professional, and airtight. That morning, Stephanie was asked to come to an interview room for what was presented as a routine matter. But when she arrived, she found herself face to face with detectives who began asking her about events from 1986. At first, the questions seemed innocuous. They were investigating an old case and wondered if she remembered anything about John Retton. But as the interview progressed, the questions became more pointed. Did she remember meeting Sherri? Had she ever been to their home? Had she known that Sherri had been murdered? Stephanie's responses were carefully measured. She admitted to knowing John but downplayed the significance of their relationship. She claimed only vague memories of hearing about Sherri's death years after the fact. She presented herself as someone who had moved on from a casual college relationship decades earlier, but the detectives had saved their ace for the end of the interview. When they revealed that her DNA had been found at the crime scene, Stephanie's carefully maintained composure began to crack. She tried to explain it away, suggesting that perhaps there had been contamination or some other innocent explanation. But there was no innocent explanation for how her DNA had ended up on a bite mark on Sherri Rasmussen's arm. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. After 23 years of living with her secret, Stephanie Lazarus was finally under arrest for murder. The trial of Stephanie Lazarus began in 2012, more than a quarter century after Sherri Rasmussen's murder. It was a case that captivated Los Angeles, both for its shocking revelations about police corruption and its testament to the power of advancing forensic science. Prosecutors painted a picture of a woman consumed by jealousy and unable to accept that the man she loved had chosen someone else. They argued that Stephanie had confronted Sherri on that February morning, perhaps intending only to intimidate or threaten her, but had lost control when the confrontation escalated into violence. The evidence was compelling. Beyond the DNA match, prosecutors presented testimony about Stephanie's obsessive behavior leading up to the murder, her visits to Sherri's workplace, and the threatening phone calls. They showed that she had used her position as a police officer to gain information about the investigation, ensuring that suspicion never fell on her. The defense attempted to argue that the DNA evidence was contaminated, or that there were innocent explanations for its presence, but they were fighting an uphill battle against overwhelming scientific evidence and a clear motive for murder. On March 8, 2012, after decades of freedom, Stephanie Lazarus was convicted of first-degree murder. The jury had seen through her carefully constructed facade and recognized her for what she truly was. Not a dedicated police officer, but a cold-blooded killer who had used her badge to escape justice. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison, finally paying the price for a crime she had committed more than a quarter century earlier. The conviction brought a measure of closure to the Rasmussen family, though nothing could truly compensate for the loss of Sherri or the decades of wondering if her killer would ever be brought to justice. The conviction of Stephanie Lazarus sent shockwaves through the LAPD and law enforcement communities across the country. It raised uncomfortable questions about how a police officer could commit such a heinous crime and then continue working alongside colleagues who were investigating that very crime. The case became a textbook example of tunnel vision in criminal investigations, the dangerous tendency for investigators to lock onto a single theory early in a case, and ignore evidence that doesn't support that theory. The original detectives' certainty that they were dealing with a burglary had prevented them from seriously considering other possibilities, including the one that ultimately proved correct. It also highlighted the challenges of investigating crimes when the perpetrator is a member of law enforcement. Police officers have unique advantages when it comes to committing crimes. They understand investigative techniques, have access to sensitive information, and benefit from the presumption that they are on the right side of the law. For the Rasmussen family, the conviction was bittersweet. While they finally had justice for Sherri, nothing could bring back the 29 years of life she had been denied. They'd spent more than 2 decades wondering if her killer would ever be caught, never knowing that the perpetrator was hiding in plain sight behind a police badge. John Retton, who had remarried and built a new life, found himself reliving the trauma of his first wife's murder as the case made its way through the courts. The revelation that someone he had once known intimately was responsible for Sherri's death added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating crime. The murder of Sherri Rasmussen serves as a sobering reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be achieved through persistence and advancing technology. DNA evidence that was useless in 1986 became the key to solving the case in 2009, proving that cases are never truly cold as long as physical evidence exists. It also demonstrates the importance of keeping an open mind during criminal investigations. The original detective's unwillingness to consider alternative theories, particularly one involving a police officer, allowed a killer to remain free for decades. Their scenario lock, the term investigators used to describe becoming fixated on a single theory, prevented them from following leads that might have solved the case years earlier. For Stephanie Lazarus, the price of her crime was not just the 27 years to life prison sentence she received. Her conviction destroyed her reputation, her career, and her family relationships. She lost everything she had built during the decades she had been free, proving that there is no such thing as the perfect crime, only crimes that haven't been solved yet. The case has become required study material in police academies and criminal justice programs, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of investigative bias and the importance of following evidence wherever it leads, regardless of how uncomfortable those conclusions might be. As recently as 2024, Stephanie Lazarus has continued to make headlines as she seeks parole from her life sentence. In October 2024, the State Board of Parole Hearings reversed an earlier decision that would have granted her parole, keeping her behind bars. The board cited the heinous nature of her crime and concerns about her suitability for release. During her parole hearings, Lazarus has acknowledged her crime, stating, "I will never ever harm an individual like I did on February 24th, 1986. When I carelessly murdered and heinously murdered Sherri Rasmussen." However, the parole board and the Rasmussen family remain unconvinced that she has truly accepted responsibility for the decades of deception that followed the murder. The case continues to resonate as a powerful example of how DNA technology can breathe new life into cold cases, giving families hope that justice can eventually be served even when years or decades have passed. It also serves as an ongoing reminder that those entrusted with upholding the law are not above it, and that accountability, while sometimes delayed, will ultimately prevail. The story of Sherri Rasmussen's murder is ultimately a story about the triumph of truth over deception, of science over prejudice, and of persistence over resignation. It reminds us that behind every cold case file is a real person whose life was cut short, and family members who never stop hoping for answers. Sherri Rasmussen was more than just a victim. She was a daughter, a wife, a nurse who dedicated her life to helping others. Her memory deserves to be about more than just how she died. She represents the countless victims of violent crime who trusted that the justice system would fight for them, even when the odds seemed impossibly long. The case also honors the dedicated investigators like Detective Jim Nuttall, who refused to let a case remain cold simply because it was old or difficult. Their commitment to seeking truth, regardless of where it leads or how long it takes, represents the very best of what law enforcement can be. As we reflect on this case, we're reminded that justice may sometimes be delayed, but it need never be denied as long as there are people willing to fight for it. The DNA that sealed Stephanie Lazarus's fate had been waiting patiently in an evidence locker for decades, ready to tell its story when technology finally advanced enough to hear it. In the end, the murder of Sherri Rasmussen became not just a story of crime and punishment, but a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of scientific advancement, and the eternal human commitment to seeking truth and justice, no matter how long the journey may take. The echoes of this case continue to influence how cold cases are investigated, how police officers are held accountable, and how families of victims can maintain hope even in the darkest circumstances. It stands as proof that some secrets, no matter how well hidden or how long protected, will eventually come to light. And perhaps most importantly, it ensures that Sherri Rasmussen's name will be remembered, not just as a victim, but as someone whose tragic death ultimately led to improvements in how justice is pursued and served. In that way, her legacy continues to make a difference in cases that are yet to be solved, and victims who are yet to receive justice. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, Let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the heart of Calgary, Alberta, where the Rocky Mountains cast their shadows across the prairie landscape, a young woman named Shannon Medel was living what many would consider a dream. At 25 years old, she possessed that rare combination of talent, ambition, and infectious optimism that seemed to draw people into her orbit like moths to a flame. Shannon wasn't just another aspiring actress in a city full of dreamers. She had something special, a natural comedic timing that could make even the most stoic person crack a smile, and a dramatic range that suggested she was destined for something greater than community theater. Her family knew it, her friends knew it, and most importantly, casting directors were beginning to take notice. It was November 2014 when everything began to change for Shannon. She had just received news that would have sent most actors into fits of euphoric celebration. She had landed what she described as the biggest audition of her career. The details were promising enough that she was already making plans to relocate to Edmonton, where better opportunities in the arts awaited her. For Shannon, this felt like the moment she had been working toward her entire adult life. But success in one area of her life couldn't mask the growing complications in another. Shannon had married Joshua Burgess just 6 months earlier, in what should have been the beginning of their happily ever after. Joshua was 29, 4 years older than Shannon, and to the outside world, they appeared to be a couple deeply in love. Their wedding had been a celebration of two people who seemed perfectly matched. She, the vivacious performer with big dreams, and he, the steady, supportive partner who seemed content to be part of her journey. Yet beneath the surface of their seemingly happy marriage, cracks were beginning to show. Shannon had confided in close family members that she was having doubts about their relationship. The timing was complicated, just as her career was beginning to take off. Her personal life was becoming a source of stress and uncertainty rather than support and joy. November 27, 2014. Started like any other day in the Burgess household on Spiller Road, Southeast. The house itself was modest but comfortable, the kind of place where a young couple might begin building their life together. Shannon had her routines, her plans, her dreams that extended far beyond the walls of that house. She was supposed to attend a family gathering in the coming days, something she would never miss without explanation. But Shannon Medel Burgess would never make it to that family gathering. When several days passed without any word from Shannon, her family knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't like her. Shannon was the type of person who stayed in constant contact with those she loved. She was reliable, considerate, and deeply connected to her family. The idea that she would simply disappear without a word was inconceivable to anyone who knew her. Her sister Erin was among the first to raise the alarm. "We're all very optimistic that my sister will be returned to us safe," she told reporters in those early days of the investigation, though the worry in her voice was impossible to miss. The family's concern wasn't just based on Shannon's reliable nature. It was also rooted in the fact that she had been so excited about her upcoming audition and the potential move to Edmonton. This was not a woman who would abandon her dreams without explanation. The Calgary Police Service launched an investigation almost immediately. Missing person cases involving young adults can be tricky. Sometimes people do decide to start over, to walk away from their lives without warning. But as investigators began to dig deeper into Shannon's disappearance, they quickly realized this wasn't a case of someone seeking a fresh start. Detective Christina Witt was assigned to the case, and she would become instrumental in uncovering the truth about what happened to Shannon. Witt was experienced in handling sensitive cases, and she approached Shannon's disappearance with both professional skepticism and genuine concern for the family's anguish. As days turned into weeks, the investigation intensified. Police canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed friends and family members, and began the painstaking process of reconstructing Shannon's final known movements. What they discovered painted a picture of a woman on the cusp of significant life changes, both professional and personal. Throughout this period, Joshua Burgess appeared to be a grieving husband. He participated in press conferences alongside Shannon's family, appealing to the public for any information that might lead to her safe return. To observers, he seemed genuinely distraught, a man desperate to have his wife back home. The image he projected was that of a loving husband who couldn't understand how his wife had simply vanished into thin air. But appearances, as investigators know all too well, can be deceiving. Winter in Calgary is harsh and unforgiving. The temperature drops well below freezing, snow blankets the landscape for months, and the ground becomes as hard as concrete. It's the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes outdoor activities not just uncomfortable but potentially dangerous. This brutal winter would prove to be both a blessing and a curse for the investigation into Shannon's disappearance. As weeks turned into months, the case began to grow cold in more ways than one, despite extensive searches, interviews, and investigative work. Shannon seemed to have simply vanished without a trace. Her family never stopped believing they would find answers, never stopped hoping she might somehow still be alive. But the reality of the situation was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. It's often said that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried or how carefully it's concealed. In Shannon's case, this would prove to be literally true. July 2015, more than 7 months after Shannon's disappearance, brought a break in the case that no one could have anticipated. Police had continued their investigation throughout the winter and spring, following up on leads and re-examining evidence. Their persistence was about to pay off in the most shocking way possible. On July 3, 2015, Calgary police arrived at the house on Spiller Road Southeast with a search warrant. They had reasons to believe that Shannon's disappearance might be connected to her own home, the place where she should have been safest. What they discovered would shatter any remaining hope that Shannon might still be alive, and it would expose a betrayal so profound that even experienced investigators struggled to comprehend it. Shannon's body was found buried in her own backyard. The discovery was both heartbreaking and horrifying. For 7 months, while her family had held vigils, given interviews, and never stopped hoping for her safe return, Shannon had been buried just feet away from the house she had shared with her husband. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone during all those months of searching, of wondering where she could be. Shannon had been at home all along, but the nightmare was far from over. When police knocked on Joshua Burgess's door with an arrest warrant, they were prepared for various scenarios. What they weren't prepared for was the dramatic scene that would unfold. Joshua initially seemed hesitant to cooperate, but as the reality of the situation became clear, something inside him broke. In a phone conversation with Detective Christina Witt, he became emotional and made a confession that would echo through the courtrooms and community for years to come. "I killed my wife," he said, his voice breaking with what sounded like genuine remorse. But Joshua's confession came with an additional shocking element. When he finally emerged from the house to surrender to police, he was covered in blood. In a final act of desperation or guilt, he had attempted to end his own life by cutting his throat. The scene was disturbing even for seasoned law enforcement officers who had dealt with countless violent crimes. As Joshua recovered from his self-inflicted injuries, the full scope of what had happened to Shannon began to emerge through police interviews and court documents. The story that unfolded was one of marriage, betrayal, and a moment of violence that would destroy multiple lives. According to the agreed statement of facts that would later be presented in court, the events of November 27, 2014 began ordinarily enough. Shannon and Joshua were at home together, and at some point during the evening they had been intimate on their living room couch. It was what happened after this moment of apparent normalcy that would prove to be fatal. During their post-intimate conversation, Shannon made a revelation that Joshua was not prepared to hear. She told him that she regretted their marriage, and that she didn't need him anymore. The words hung in the air between them, a devastating declaration that their 6-month marriage was effectively over. For Shannon, this may have felt like an honest acknowledgement of what she had been feeling for some time, that her marriage was not what she had hoped it would be, that her husband was not the partner she needed. As she pursued her dreams and built her career, she was 25 years old, talented, and on the verge of what could have been a breakthrough in her acting career. Perhaps she felt that being honest about her feelings was the first step toward reclaiming her life and her future. For Joshua, however, Shannon's words triggered something dark and violent. Instead of responding with hurt, anger, or even an attempt at discussion, he chose a path that would destroy everything. The attack began with Joshua's hands around Shannon's throat. Court documents would later reveal that he strangled her manually first, but when that didn't achieve his apparent goal of silencing her forever, he escalated the violence. He retrieved a belt and used it to continue choking Shannon until she could no longer breathe, could no longer speak, could no longer dream of the future that had seemed so bright just hours earlier. When investigators later asked Joshua to explain his actions, his response was as chilling as it was simple. He told police that he killed Shannon to make her stop talking. The casualness of this explanation, the matter-of-fact way he reduced his wife's murder to stopping an unwanted conversation, revealed a level of callousness that shocked even experienced detectives. But Joshua's crimes didn't end with Shannon's murder. What he did next showed a calculated approach to covering up his actions that contradicted any claim that this was a crime of passion or temporary insanity. After killing Shannon, Joshua moved her body to the deck of their house. He then began the gruesome process of planning how to dispose of the evidence of his crime. The harsh Calgary winter that was approaching would provide him with the perfect cover for his plan. Using the frozen ground as both challenge and opportunity, Joshua dug a grave in their front yard. The physical effort required to break through the frozen earth and dig deep enough to bury a human body would have been enormous. But Joshua was motivated by the need to hide what he had done. Once the grave was complete, he moved Shannon's body from the deck to its final resting place, literally burying his wife in the yard of the home they had shared. Then came perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case: the cover-up. For 7 months, Joshua Burgess lived a lie that was so comprehensive and convincing that it fooled Shannon's family friends and initially the police themselves. He attended press conferences, standing alongside Shannon's grief-stricken family as they pleaded for information about their missing daughter and sister. He looked directly into television cameras and appealed for Shannon's safe return, knowing full well that her body was buried in his front yard. He comforted Shannon's mother, Lisa, and her sister, Erin, even as they struggled with the agony of not knowing what had happened to their beloved Shannon. The psychological manipulation required to maintain such a deception is difficult to comprehend. Every day for 7 months, Joshua woke up and made the choice to continue the charade. Every time Shannon's family called with hope in their voices, every time they organized search parties or held vigils, every time they clung to the possibility that Shannon might still be alive, Joshua knew the truth and said nothing. During those 7 months, life went on around the Burgess house in ways both ordinary and surreal. Neighbors walked by, completely unaware that Shannon's body lay buried beneath their feet as they passed by the front yard. Mail carriers delivered letters. Seasons changed. Snow fell and melted, and through it all, Shannon remained hidden beneath the ground, while her family's suffering continued above. The investigation that ultimately led to Shannon's discovery was painstaking and methodical. Detective Christina Witt and her colleagues never stopped working the case, even when leads seemed to dry up and the trail appeared to grow cold. They re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined evidence, and continued to focus on the inconsistencies in Joshua's story and behavior. It was this persistent investigative work that eventually led police back to the Burgess house with search warrant in hand. When they made the decision to search the property, they were following investigative instincts honed by years of experience. But even they could not have fully prepared themselves for what they would find. The discovery of Shannon's body in July 2015 brought both resolution and fresh heartbreak to her family. On one hand, they finally had answers about what had happened to their daughter and sister. They could finally lay her to rest properly and begin the long process of grieving. But on the other hand, they had to confront the devastating reality that the man they had trusted, the man they had welcomed into their family, had not only killed Shannon, but had looked them in the eye for 7 months while maintaining the lie. The betrayal felt by Shannon's family was profound and multifaceted. They had lost Shannon, which was devastating enough, but they had also been manipulated and deceived by someone they had considered family. The grief counselor would later describe their experience as a double trauma. First, the loss of Shannon, and then the realization of how thoroughly they had been betrayed by Joshua. Erin Medel, Shannon's sister, would later speak about the impact of learning the truth. The family had spent months hoping, praying, organizing searches, and appealing to the public for help. They had imagined countless scenarios about what might have happened to Shannon, but the reality that she had been murdered by her own husband and buried in their front yard while he lied to their faces was worse than anything they had imagined. Joshua Burgess was initially charged with second-degree murder, and he pleaded not guilty. The legal proceedings stretched on, adding another layer of stress and trauma to Shannon's family's ordeal. They would have to relive the details of Shannon's death, confront Joshua in court, and wait to see if justice would be served. However, in a development that spared Shannon's family the trauma of a lengthy trial, Joshua changed his plea to guilty just 1 day before his trial was scheduled to begin. This plea change meant that the full details of the case would be presented through an agreed statement of facts rather than through witness testimony and cross-examination. The sentencing hearing revealed more details about the crime and its aftermath. Joshua was ultimately sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 15 years, which was the standard sentence for second-degree murder in Canada at the time. While this sentence meant that Joshua would spend many years behind bars, it also meant that he might someday be eligible for parole. a possibility that continued to cause distress to Shannon's family. The case of Shannon Medel Burgess raises troubling questions about domestic violence, the facade that abusers can maintain, and the devastating impact of intimate partner homicide on families and communities. Shannon and Joshua's marriage had appeared happy to outsiders, with no documented history of domestic violence or abuse. Yet behind closed doors, tensions were building that would ultimately explode in the most violent way possible. Experts in domestic violence point out that Shannon's case illustrates several concerning patterns. The fact that Shannon felt she needed to express regret about their marriage suggests that she may have been feeling trapped or unhappy in ways that weren't visible to others. The timing of her murder, just as she was experiencing professional success and planning to relocate for better opportunities, may not have been coincidental. Many domestic violence experts note that perpetrators often escalate their controlling and violent behavior when their partners are becoming more independent or successful. Shannon's career was taking off. She was planning to move to a new city, and she was expressing doubts about her marriage. For someone with controlling tendencies, these developments might have felt like threats to their power and dominance in the relationship. Joshua's response to Shannon's expression of regret, immediate and deadly violence, suggests a level of possessiveness and control that may not have been apparent to casual observers. His explanation that he killed her to make her stop talking reveals a mindset where Shannon's autonomy, her right to express her feelings and make decisions about her own life, was seen as something that needed to be silenced permanently. The elaborate cover-up that followed Shannon's murder also speaks to Joshua's capacity for manipulation and deception. This wasn't a crime of passion followed by immediate remorse and confession. Instead, it was followed by months of calculated deception designed to avoid consequences while Shannon's family suffered. Shannon's story also highlights the particular vulnerability that can exist in newly married couples. Shannon and Joshua had been married for only 6 months when she was killed. They were still in what should have been the honeymoon phase of their marriage, still learning about each other and adjusting to married life. The fact that their marriage ended in murder after such a short time suggests that there may have been warning signs that were missed or ignored. For Shannon's family, the years following her murder have been marked by both grief and a determination to honor her memory. They have spoken publicly about Shannon's dreams, her talent, and her vibrant personality, working to ensure that she is remembered for who she was rather than just how she died. The family has also had to navigate the ongoing trauma of knowing that Joshua may someday be eligible for parole. In 2025, Joshua's application for day parole was denied, but the possibility that he might someday be released remains a source of ongoing distress for Shannon's loved ones. Shannon's mother, Lisa, has become an advocate for other families affected by intimate partner homicide. She has spoken about the unique trauma experienced by families who are deceived by perpetrators, and the additional healing that is required when trust has been so thoroughly violated. The case has also had an impact on the Calgary community and the broader conversation about domestic violence in Canada. Shannon's murder occurred during what should have been one of the happiest times in her life. Her career was flourishing, she had exciting opportunities ahead of her, and she was young enough to believe that anything was possible. The tragedy of Shannon's story is not just that her life was cut short, but that it was cut short at the moment when her dreams were finally within reach. She had worked hard to develop her talent. She had persevered through the challenges that every aspiring actor faces, and she was finally seeing the results of her dedication and persistence. The big audition that Shannon had landed, the one that was supposed to be her breakthrough, became instead the backdrop for her disappearance and murder. What should have been a celebration of her success became the timeline by which investigators would later reconstruct the final days of her life. In the years since Shannon's murder, her family has worked to keep her memory alive in positive ways. They have shared stories about her sense of humor, her dedication to her craft, and her loyalty to the people she loved. They have also used their experience to help other families navigate the complex trauma of losing a loved one to intimate partner violence. Shannon's case serves as a reminder that domestic violence can occur in relationships that appear healthy from the outside, and that the early stages of a marriage or relationship can be particularly dangerous times for potential victims. It also illustrates the devastating ripple effects that intimate partner homicide has on families and communities. The investigation and legal proceedings in Shannon's case demonstrated both the dedication of law enforcement professionals and the importance of never giving up on missing person cases. Detective Christina Witt and her colleagues worked tirelessly for months to uncover the truth about Shannon's disappearance, even when the trail seemed cold and hope seemed dim. Today, Shannon Medel Burgess is remembered not just as a victim of domestic violence, but as a talented young woman who had dreams and ambitions that extended far beyond the tragic circumstances of her death. Her story continues to serve as both a tragedy and a warning, a reminder of the importance of recognizing the signs of domestic violence and the devastating consequences when intimate partner abuse escalates to murder. As we reflect on Shannon's story, we're reminded of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing our relationships with the people we love. Shannon's family had no way of knowing that November 27, 2014 would be the last day they would ever speak to her. They had no way of knowing that their daughter and sister, who was so full of life and hope, would become the victim of the very person who was supposed to love and protect her. The case of Shannon Medel Burgess stands as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement professionals who refuse to give up on victims, to the resilience of families who find ways to honor their loved ones, even in the midst of unimaginable grief, and to the importance of continuing to work toward a world where intimate partner violence is recognized, prevented, and stopped before it escalates to tragedy. Shannon's dreams of a successful acting career were cut short by violence, but her story continues to have an impact, serving as a reminder of what we lose when domestic violence claims another life, and why we must never stop working to prevent such tragedies from occurring. In the quiet moments of the night when we reflect on stories like Shannon's, we're reminded of the preciousness of life and the importance of treating each other with kindness, respect, and love. Shannon deserved to see her dreams realized, deserved to have the chance to share her talents with the world, and deserved to live a long and fulfilling life surrounded by people who truly loved her. Her story, while tragic, serves as a reminder to value the people in our lives and to never take for granted the time we have with those we love. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us to listen when someone we care about expresses concerns about their safety or their relationship, because sometimes speaking up can make the difference between life and death. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we journey to the quiet town of Greeley, Colorado, in the winter of 1984, where a young girl's disappearance would become one of the most haunting cold cases in American history. This is the story of Janelle Matthews, a story that spans 35 years, filled with false leads, shattered hope, and ultimately a resolution that few could have predicted. The snow was falling softly on December 20th, 1984, blanketing the suburban streets of Greeley, Colorado in pristine white. Christmas was just 5 days away, and the holiday spirit filled the air with anticipation and joy. For 12-year-old Janelle Matthews, this Thursday evening began like many others, with music, friendship, and the warm glow of community celebration. Janelle was not your typical 7th grader. Born on February 9, 1972, she had entered the world under difficult circumstances. Her birth mother, Terry Vieira, was only 13 years old when she gave birth at Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara, California. Unable to care for the infant, Terry made the difficult decision to place her daughter for adoption. 6 weeks later, James, Jim, and Gloria Matthews welcomed the baby into their loving home, giving her the name Janelle Renee Matthews. The Matthews family was warm and stable. Jim worked as a dedicated father and husband, while Gloria devoted herself to raising their daughters. Janelle joined an older sister, Jennifer, and together the girls grew up in the kind of middle-class American household that represented the dreams of the 1970s and early 1980s. The family lived in a split-level home in a quiet neighborhood where children rode bicycles on tree-lined streets and neighbors knew each other's names. At 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighing 15 pounds, Janelle was a bright, energetic girl with brown hair and brown eyes. She had pierced ears and wore braces, the kind of details that made her distinctly herself in a world where 12-year-olds often felt invisible. She was involved in school activities, particularly music, where her voice had earned her a place in the middle school's honor choir. On this particular December evening, Janelle was preparing for what would become the most significant performance of her young life, though not for reasons anyone could have imagined. The middle school's honor choir was scheduled to perform Christmas carols at a local cable television broadcast, a community event that brought together families and celebrated the season of giving. Janelle's friend Deanna was also in the choir, and the two girls had been looking forward to this performance for weeks. They had practiced their harmonies, learned their parts, and prepared to share the joy of Christmas music with their community. It was the kind of innocent, wholesome activity that defined small-town American life in the 1980s. But this evening would be different from all the others. As Janelle prepared for the concert, She had no way of knowing that she was living through her final hours of ordinary life. The last moments when she would be just another 7th grader getting ready for a school performance. The honor choir performance went beautifully. Janelle and Deanna stood together with their classmates, their young voices joining in traditional Christmas carols as the local cable network broadcast their performance to homes throughout the Greeley area. The girls were proud of their performance, chatting excitedly as the evening wound down and parents began arriving to collect their children. However, the Matthews family was experiencing one of those modern scheduling conflicts that every family knows well. Jim Matthews had committed to attending his older daughter Jennifer's high school basketball game that same evening. Meanwhile, Gloria Matthews was out of state, visiting her ailing father in California. The family had arranged for Deanna's father, Russell Ross, to drive both girls home after the concert. As the performance ended and the other children were collected by their families, Janelle said goodbye to her friend and climbed into Mr. Ross's car for the short drive to her family's split-level home. The ride was uneventful, just two families helping each other navigate the busy schedules that come with raising active children. At approximately 8 o'clock in the evening, Russell Ross pulled into the driveway of the Matthews home. He noticed that the garage door was partially open, but this didn't concern him particularly. Many families left their garage doors partially open, especially when expecting family members to return home later in the evening. Janelle thanked Mr. Ross for the ride, gathered her things, and walked toward her house. Russell Ross waited in the driveway for a few minutes, as any responsible adult would do when dropping off a child. He wanted to ensure that Janelle got safely inside before he drove away. He watched as she approached the house, and he saw her enter through what appeared to be the front door. Satisfied that she was safely home, he backed out of the driveway and drove into the night, never imagining that he would be the last person to see Janelle Matthews alive. Inside the house, Janelle appeared to be settling in for a quiet evening alone. She had been in the middle of working on cross-stitch embroidery, Christmas gifts she was making for family members. This was typical of Janelle. She was a thoughtful girl who enjoyed creating handmade presents for the people she loved. She had kicked off the shoes she had worn to the concert, leaving them on the floor of her room, and had turned on the space heater to keep warm on this cold December night. At 8:30 p.m., just 30 minutes after arriving home, Janelle received a phone call. The caller was someone from the honor choir, asking about the performance that evening. Janelle chatted briefly about how well the concert had gone, her voice cheerful and normal. This phone call would later become crucial evidence, as it established that Janelle was alive and well in her home at 8:30 p.m. on December 20th. But somewhere between 8:30 p.m. and 9:30 p.m., when her father and sister returned from the basketball game, Janelle Matthews vanished without a trace. When Jim and Jennifer Matthews returned home from the basketball game around 9:30 p.m., they expected to find Janelle curled up with her cross-stitch project, perhaps watching television or getting ready for bed. Instead, they found an empty house that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The front door was unlocked. Janelle's shoes lay on the floor where she had kicked them off earlier. Her cross-stitch materials were scattered around her room, as if she had been interrupted in the middle of working on her Christmas gifts. The space heater was still running, filling the room with warmth for someone who was no longer there. Jim Matthews called out for his daughter, searching the house room by room. He checked closets, looked under beds, and called her name repeatedly. The house felt empty in a way that was immediately alarming, not the emptiness of someone stepping outside briefly, but the profound absence of someone who had simply vanished. As panic began to set in, Jim Matthews did what any father would do. He began calling Janelle's friends, hoping to find that she had simply gone to visit someone without leaving a note. But call after call yielded the same result. No one had seen Janelle since the choir performance. Deanna confirmed that she had seen Janelle get dropped off at home, but that was hours ago now. By 10 o'clock, Jim Matthews knew that something was terribly wrong. He contacted the Greeley Police Department to report his daughter missing. The dispatcher took the information, but there was an initial hesitancy to treat this as an emergency. 12-year-old children don't typically disappear from their homes without explanation, and the assumption was that Janelle had probably gone to visit a friend and would return soon. But Jim Matthews knew his daughter. Janelle was not the type of child to leave home without permission, especially not on a school night in December. She was responsible, predictable, and deeply connected to her family. Her disappearance was completely out of character, and her father's growing panic was entirely justified. The police arrived at the Matthews home and began their initial investigation. They searched the house thoroughly, looking for any signs of struggle or disturbance. What they found was both minimal and deeply unsettling. Everything appeared normal except for one crucial detail. Outside in the snow, investigators discovered footprints. But these were not ordinary footprints. Someone had attempted to eliminate them using a garden rake. The rake, Jim Matthews realized with growing horror, had come right out of my garage. Someone had been in their garage, had taken their rake, and had tried to cover their tracks in the snow outside the family's home. This discovery transformed what might have been treated as a runaway case into an obvious crime scene. 12-year-old girls do not disappear from their homes and then carefully rake away evidence in the snow. Someone had taken Janelle Matthews, and that someone had tried to cover their tracks. The Greeley Police Department mobilized quickly once they understood the severity of the situation. Detectives arrived at the scene, photographers documented the evidence, and a systematic search began immediately. The raked footprints in the snow told a story that no parent ever wants to confront. Their daughter had been taken by someone who was careful, deliberate, and concerned about leaving evidence behind. The investigation began with the obvious suspects and scenarios. In cases involving missing children, statistics unfortunately point toward family members as the most likely perpetrators. Investigators focused their initial attention on Jim Matthews himself, subjecting him to intense scrutiny and repeated questioning. This is standard procedure, but it was devastating for a father who was already living through his worst nightmare. Jim Matthews cooperated fully with the investigation, submitting to polygraph tests and repeated interviews. He provided detailed timelines of his whereabouts during the evening, corroborated by multiple witnesses who had been with him at Jennifer's basketball game. Gradually, investigators became convinced that Jim Matthews was not involved in his daughter's disappearance. But the intense scrutiny added another layer of trauma to an already unbearable situation. The investigation expanded to include friends, neighbors, and anyone who might have had contact with Janelle. Detectives interviewed her classmates, teachers, and fellow choir members. They spoke with Russell Ross multiple times, confirming his account of dropping Janelle off at home. They investigated whether Janelle might have had any contact with strangers, or whether anyone had been watching the family or showing unusual interest in the girl. Search teams combed through the neighborhood and surrounding areas. Volunteers joined police officers and search and rescue teams in methodical searches of parks, vacant lots, wooded areas, and any place where a missing child might be found. The community of Greeley rallied around the Matthews family, with hundreds of people participating in the search efforts. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, no trace of Janelle Matthews was found. There were no witnesses, no reliable leads, and no physical evidence beyond those mysterious raked footprints in the snow. The case began to take on the characteristics that every detective dreads. It was becoming a cold case. The media attention was intense. Janelle's disappearance captured national attention, and her photograph appeared on milk cartons across the country, part of the famous Missing Children campaign of the 1980s. The image of the smiling 12-year-old girl with braces became a symbol of every parent's worst fear, and the case generated thousands of tips and potential leads from across the United States. Investigators followed up on every lead, no matter how far-fetched. They traveled to different states to investigate sightings, pursued theories about potential abductors, and explored every possible scenario. Some tips seemed promising initially, but led nowhere. Others were obviously false, but still required investigation. The volume of tips was both a blessing and a curse. Each one represented hope that Janelle might be found, but each dead end deepened the family's despair. As 1985 arrived and passed without resolution, the Janelle Matthews case began to fade from the headlines. New missing children cases emerged, capturing public attention and resources. The active investigation continued, but with diminishing intensity. Detectives moved on to other cases, though they never officially closed the file on Janelle Matthews. For the Matthews family, however, there was no moving on. Jim and Gloria Matthews became advocates for missing children, working with organizations to keep their daughter's case in the public eye, and to help other families facing similar tragedies. They never gave up hope that Janelle might be found alive, but as the years passed, that hope became increasingly difficult to maintain. The 1990s and 2000s passed with painful slowness for the Matthews family. Birthdays came and went, February 9th each year serving as a reminder of the daughter who was not there to celebrate. Christmas became a season of particular difficulty, forever marked by the memory of that December evening when everything changed. Jim Matthews became a familiar figure in the missing children advocacy community. He spoke at conferences, worked with law enforcement agencies, and never stopped searching for answers about what happened to his daughter. Gloria Matthews channeled her grief into supporting other families, understanding as few people could the particular agony of not knowing what happened to a child. Meanwhile, the case remained officially open, but practically dormant. Occasionally, new tips would emerge, or advances in forensic technology would offer new possibilities for evidence analysis. DNA testing became more sophisticated, and cold case units were established in many police departments to revisit unsolved crimes with fresh perspectives and new tools. But for more than 30 years, none of these developments brought the Matthews family any closer to answers. Janelle's bedroom remained largely unchanged, a shrine to a girl who had been frozen in time at age 12. Her cross-stitch projects remained unfinished, her Christmas gifts never completed. The community of Greeley never forgot Janelle Matthews. Her disappearance had become part of the town's history, a reminder of the vulnerability that exists even in the safest seeming places. Newer residents learned about the case from longtime neighbors, and missing person posters bearing Janelle's photograph remained visible around town for decades. Some family members and friends began to accept that they might never learn what happened to Janelle. Others, particularly Jim Matthews, refused to give up hope. He maintained contact with law enforcement agencies, stayed informed about new investigative techniques, and continued to believe that someday, somehow, the truth would emerge. Little did anyone know that the truth was closer than they imagined, and that it would finally surface in the most unexpected way possible. July 24, 2019, began as an ordinary summer day for the construction crew working on a pipeline project southeast of Greeley, Colorado. The workers were engaged in the routine task of installing new infrastructure, digging and excavating in areas that had remained undisturbed for decades. It was hot, dusty work in the Colorado sun, the kind of industrial project that happens constantly across America without attracting any particular attention. But at approximately 2:30 p.m., the construction work came to an abrupt halt. One of the workers had uncovered something that clearly didn't belong in the ground with the pipes and cables they were installing. The object was small, weathered, and unmistakably human. It was a skull. The construction site was immediately secured, and the Weld County Sheriff's Office was called to the scene. Detectives and forensic specialists arrived quickly, recognizing that they were potentially dealing with a homicide investigation. The area was cordoned off, and a careful archaeological excavation began. Over the next several hours, investigators uncovered additional human remains. The skeleton was small, consistent with a child or adolescent. The remains had been in the ground for a very long time, decades, based on the condition of the bones and the surrounding soil. Most significantly, forensic examination revealed that the skull showed evidence of trauma consistent with a gunshot wound to the head. The location of the discovery was significant. The construction site was approximately 15 miles southeast of Greeley in a remote area that was largely undeveloped. It was exactly the kind of place where someone might dispose of a body, expecting it to remain hidden indefinitely. As news of the discovery spread through law enforcement channels, investigators immediately began considering whether these remains might be connected to one of the area's most famous unsolved cases. The size of the skeleton, the estimated time the remains had been in the ground, and the location all pointed toward one possibility that had haunted the community for 35 years. Could these be the remains of Janelle Matthews? DNA testing was ordered immediately. Samples from the remains were compared against DNA profiles from the Matthews family. The process took several weeks, during which the community held its breath and the Matthews family prepared themselves for news they had waited decades to receive. On August 24, 2019, the results were confirmed. The remains found by the construction workers were definitively those of Janelle Matthews. After 35 years of searching, wondering, and hoping against hope, the 12-year-old girl had finally been found. The discovery answered one of the most fundamental questions about the case. Janelle Matthews had not run away, had not been taken far from home, and had not somehow survived her ordeal. She had been murdered on or shortly after December 20th, 1984, killed by a gunshot wound to the head, and her body had been disposed of in a remote location, where her killer expected it would never be found. But even as this discovery provided closure to one aspect of the case, it raised urgent new questions. Who had killed Janelle Matthews? How had they managed to abduct her from her home, murder her, and dispose of her body without leaving a trace for 35 years? And perhaps most importantly, was the killer still alive, still living freely while the Matthews family had suffered for decades? The discovery of Janelle Matthews' remains transformed a cold case into an active homicide investigation. The Weld County Sheriff's Office and the Greeley Police Department formed a joint task force, bringing together detectives, forensic specialists, and federal agents with decades of combined experience in solving complex crimes. The investigation began with a comprehensive review of the original case files. Detectives studied every report, every interview, every tip that had been collected over the past 35 years. They used modern investigative techniques to analyze evidence that had been collected in 1984, applying DNA analysis, advanced fingerprint comparison, and other forensic methods that hadn't existed when Janelle first disappeared. One name began to emerge from the old files with increasing frequency: Stephen Dana Pankey. In 1984, Pankey had been a resident of Greeley, living just a few miles from the Matthews family home. He had been interviewed by police shortly after Janelle's disappearance. But like many people in the community, he had been considered a peripheral figure in the investigation. What made Pankey interesting to modern investigators was not what he had told police in 1984, but what he had said and done in the years since. Over the decades, Pankey had shown an unusual and persistent interest in the Janelle Matthews case. He had contacted law enforcement agencies multiple times, offering information and theories about what might have happened to the girl. He had inserted himself into online discussions about the case, demonstrating detailed knowledge about aspects of the investigation that had never been made public. Most significantly, Pankey had made statements over the years that suggested he knew more about Janelle's disappearance than he should have known. He had mentioned details about the crime scene and the investigation that had not been released to the public. He had offered theories about how the crime might have been committed that were surprisingly accurate given what investigators now knew about how Janelle had died. Stephen Pankey had also lived a life that attracted attention from law enforcement. He had run for governor of Idaho in 2014 and 2018, campaigns that were largely unsuccessful but that brought him public attention. He had been involved in various legal disputes and had a history of making inflammatory statements about political and social issues. But it was Pankey's behavior regarding the Janelle Matthews case that most interested investigators. His pattern of inserting himself into the investigation, combined with his apparent knowledge of non-public details, suggested the possibility that he was not merely an interested observer, but someone with direct knowledge of the crime. In 2019, after Janelle's remains were discovered, investigators decided to interview Pankey again. This time, however, their approach was different. Rather than treating him as a potential witness, they approached him as a potential suspect in a murder investigation. Pankey's reaction to this new round of questioning was telling. According to investigators, he immediately asked for a lawyer and inquired about making a deal. This response suggested consciousness of guilt and awareness that he was in serious legal jeopardy. The investigation intensified, with detectives focusing on building a case against Pankey. They interviewed his former friends, neighbors, and associates. They examined his whereabouts on December 20th. They analyzed his statements over the years, looking for contradictions and evidence of guilty knowledge. Perhaps most importantly, they interviewed Pankey's ex-wife, Angela Hicks. What she told them would prove to be the breakthrough that investigators had been waiting for. Angela Hicks had been married to Stephen Pankey in 1984, and she had lived with him in Greeley at the time of Janelle Matthews' disappearance. For 35 years, she had carried knowledge that would prove crucial to solving the case. But it wasn't until after Janelle's remains were discovered that she came forward with her story. According to Hicks, Pankey's behavior in the days following Janelle's disappearance had been strange and suspicious. She recalled that he had shown an unusual interest in the case from the very beginning, following news coverage obsessively and discussing the disappearance frequently. This level of interest might not have been unusual by itself. The case had captured the attention of the entire community, but Hicks remembered other details that were more troubling. Hicks told investigators that Pankey had made statements suggesting that he knew more about the case than he should have known. She recalled him mentioning details about the crime that had not been released to the public. Most significantly, she remembered him making statements that suggested Janelle had been shot, information that was not known to anyone outside the investigation until her remains were discovered 35 years later. Even more damning was Hicks's recollection of Pankey's behavior immediately after the crime. She told investigators that Pankey had unexpectedly announced that the family needed to take a trip to visit relatives in another state. This trip had occurred just days after Janelle's disappearance, at a time when the entire community was focused on searching for the missing girl. Hicks had found this timing strange at the time, but she had not connected it to Janelle's disappearance until years later. Looking back with the perspective of decades, she began to wonder whether Pankey's urgent need to leave town had been motivated by something other than a desire to visit family. There were other troubling memories as well. Hicks recalled that Pankey had owned a gun in 1984, though she could not remember exactly what type of weapon it was. She remembered him being familiar with the area where Janelle's body was eventually found, having been in that general vicinity for various reasons over the years. Perhaps most significantly, Hicks described a pattern of behavior that continued for years after Janelle's disappearance. Pankey continued to show an obsessive interest in the case, bringing it up in conversations, following news coverage, and making statements that suggested insider knowledge. This behavior had made Hicks increasingly uncomfortable over the years, though she had not initially connected it to the possibility that her husband might have been directly involved in the crime. Hicks's decision to come forward was not easy. She was potentially implicating her ex-husband in a child murder case, a decision that would have profound consequences for her own life as well as his. But she told investigators that she could no longer remain silent, knowing what she knew about Pankey's behavior and statements. Her testimony provided investigators with the foundation they needed to build a case against Stephen Pankey, combined with his own suspicious behavior over the years, and his apparent knowledge of non-public details about the crime. Hicks's recollections painted a picture of a man who was not merely interested in the Janelle Matthews case, but who had direct personal knowledge of what had happened to the 12-year-old girl. On October 13, 2020, nearly 36 years after Janelle Matthews disappeared, a grand jury in Weld County, Colorado, returned an indictment charging Stephen Dana Pankey with first-degree murder and kidnapping in connection with her death. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community of Greeley and brought a mixture of relief and apprehension to the Matthews family. Pankey was arrested at his home in Idaho, where he had been living since leaving Colorado decades earlier. His arrest made national news, not only because of the high-profile nature of the case, but also because of Pankey's own public profile as a former gubernatorial candidate. The image of the former political candidate being led away in handcuffs became a symbol of how justice can sometimes take decades to arrive. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and drawn out. Pankey's first trial began in 2021, and it quickly became clear that prosecuting a 36-year-old murder case would present significant challenges. Much of the physical evidence from 1984 had been lost or degraded over time. Key witnesses had died or could no longer remember crucial details. The case would largely depend on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of Pankey's ex-wife. Pankey's defense team argued that their client was being scapegoated for an unsolved crime. They claimed that Pankey's interest in the case was simply the result of an obsession with true crime, not guilty knowledge. They pointed out that Pankey had Asperger's syndrome, which they argued explained his unusual behavior and his tendency to insert himself into discussions about criminal cases. The defense also presented an alternative theory of the crime, suggesting that the real killer was a man named Norris Drake, who had connections to the Greeley area in 1984. They argued that investigators had focused on Pankey because of his unusual behavior, while the real killer had escaped detection. The first trial ended in a mistrial when the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. This outcome was devastating for the Matthews family, who had waited decades for justice and now faced the possibility that the case might never be resolved. However, prosecutors decided to retry Pankey, believing that they had a strong case despite the challenges. The second trial began in October 2022, with many of the same witnesses and much of the same evidence. This time, however, the prosecution was able to present a more coherent narrative of Pankey's guilt. They emphasized his detailed knowledge of non-public aspects of the case, his suspicious behavior in the aftermath of the crime, and his ex-wife's testimony about his statements and actions. The defense continued to argue that Pankey was innocent, suggesting that his unusual behavior was explained by his psychological condition rather than by guilt. They maintained that the real killer had never been identified and that Pankey was being convicted based on speculation rather than solid evidence. But on October 31, 2022, almost exactly 38 years after Janelle Matthews disappeared, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on both charges: first-degree murder and kidnapping. Stephen Pankey was immediately sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years, when he would be 89 years old. The conviction brought a measure of closure to the Matthews family and to the community of Greeley. After nearly 4 decades of uncertainty, they finally had answers about what had happened to Janelle Matthews and who was responsible for her death. The conviction of Stephen Pankey marked the end of one of the longest-running cold cases in Colorado history. But it also raised profound questions about justice, time, and the nature of closure in cases involving violent crime. For Jim Matthews, now in his 70s, the conviction represented a victory that had come at an enormous personal cost. He had spent nearly 4 decades of his life searching for answers about his daughter's fate, becoming an advocate for missing children, and working tirelessly to keep Janelle's case in the public eye. The knowledge that her killer had finally been brought to justice provided some measure of peace, but it could never restore the years of anguish or bring back the daughter he had lost. Gloria Matthews had died in 2007, 17 years before her daughter's killer was finally identified and convicted. She had spent the last 23 years of her life not knowing what had happened to Janelle, carrying the pain of uncertainty to her grave. The resolution of the case was bittersweet for the family, knowing that Gloria had not lived to see justice served. The case also raised questions about how such crimes can remain unsolved for so long, and what factors finally led to a resolution. The discovery of Janelle's remains was purely accidental, the result of routine construction work rather than investigative breakthrough. Without that chance discovery, it's possible that the case might never have been solved. The role of Angela Hicks was also crucial. Her decision to come forward with information about her ex-husband's suspicious behavior provided investigators with the foundation they needed to build a case. But her testimony also raised questions about why she had remained silent for so long, and whether earlier disclosure might have led to justice decades sooner. Stephen Pankey himself maintained his innocence throughout the legal proceedings and continued to claim that he had been wrongfully convicted. His supporters argued that he had been targeted because of his unusual personality and his obsessive interest in true crime cases, rather than because of solid evidence of guilt. These claims highlighted the challenges inherent in prosecuting cold cases, based largely on circumstantial evidence. The investigation revealed troubling details about the crime itself. Forensic analysis of Janelle's remains confirmed that she had died from a gunshot wound to the head, suggesting that her death had been quick rather than the result of prolonged suffering. This provided some small comfort to her family, knowing that she had not endured extended torment. The location where her body was found, 15 miles from her home in a remote area, suggested that her killer had planned the disposal carefully. This contradicted theories that her disappearance might have been the result of an impulsive crime or a case of opportunity. Instead, it pointed to premeditation and careful planning. The case also highlighted advances in forensic science and investigative techniques that had made the eventual resolution possible. DNA analysis, improved fingerprint comparison methods, and modern approaches to cold case investigation had all played roles in building the case against Pankey. These tools had not existed in 1984, when the original investigation had stalled. As we reach the end of this long and tragic story, it's important to remember that at its heart, this is not just a tale of crime and punishment, but a story about a family's love and a community's refusal to forget. Janelle Matthews was 12 years old when her life was cut short on that December evening in 1984. She was a girl who made Christmas gifts by hand, who sang in the school choir, and who had braces and pierced ears like millions of other American teenagers. She was someone's daughter, sister, and friend, a person whose life had value far beyond the circumstances of her death. The nearly 4 decades that passed between her disappearance and the resolution of her case represented a lifetime of grief for those who loved her. Her father, Jim Matthews, spent his adult life searching for answers, advocating for other missing children, and refusing to give up hope that justice would eventually be served. His persistence and dedication helped ensure that Janelle's case was never completely forgotten, even during the long years when leads dried up and the investigation stalled. The community of Greeley, Colorado also played a crucial role in keeping Janelle's memory alive. From the initial search efforts in 1984 to the continued attention paid to the case over the decades, the people of Greeley demonstrated that some disappearances are too important to forget. Their collective memory and continued concern helped maintain pressure on law enforcement to continue pursuing the case. The resolution of the Janelle Matthews case offers both hope and soberness for families dealing with similar tragedies. It demonstrates that justice can sometimes arrive even after decades, that cold cases can be solved with persistence and new technology, and that victims are not forgotten even when investigations stall. But it also shows the enormous cost of such prolonged uncertainty, the years of anguish that families endure while waiting for answers. Today, Janelle Matthews rests in peace, her remains finally laid to rest with dignity after 35 years in an unmarked grave in a remote field. Her killer has been brought to justice, convicted and sentenced to spend the remainder of his life in prison. The questions that haunted her family for decades have finally been answered, But perhaps most importantly, Janelle Matthews is remembered not just as a victim of crime, but as a person who mattered, a 12-year-old girl whose life, though tragically brief, had meaning and value. Her story serves as a reminder that behind every cold case is a real person who was loved, missed, and mourned. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Janelle Matthews not for the circumstances of her death, but for the life she lived, however brief it was. Remember a girl who sang Christmas carols, who made gifts with her own hands, and who mattered enough to a community that they never stopped looking for answers. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson of this long and difficult story, that love endures, that some searches never end, and that justice, though it may be delayed, can sometimes still be served. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.